sticker said, man thinks, God knows. And then someone had bought a second copy of the bumper sticker and cut it apart and reversed it and put it under it. So it said, man thinks, God knows, man thinks. Now, it seemed to me there was a lot going on in what was attempting to be expressed here. First of all, something about God, that God knows, that God exists in a superior state of intellection. Plato said time is the moving image of eternity. My notion of God's cognition is simply the regarding of all points in the space-time continuum with equal clarity. God knows. The limited program of knowing is thought, cognition. Man thinks. This is what man can do in imitation of the all-knowing and omniscient example of God. But implicit is that this is somehow a limited undertaking, this thinking of man. And some of you may recall the famous comment of Pascal that man is a reed bent by the wind, and then Pascal added, but a thinking reed. So then the second half of the conundrum was that God knows, man thinks. Now this, I thought, was very interesting, because it seems to imply a relationship between the limited project of knowing, which is human thought, and the completed project of knowing, which is omniscience. God knows, man thinks. In a way, what this is saying is that God knows that man is making his way toward God. God knows, man thinks. God knows that man is participating in the same project of being that God regards from this higher dimensional space. And so then this meditation on these 4 lines closes with the recurso, which returns you then to this realization that what we are talking about is the project of knowing, Heidegger called it, carried out on 2 levels, on the level of omniscience and on the level of limited being. So then I meditated on this after we discussed it yesterday, and I thought tonight it might be interesting then to talk about the thinking project that is the essence of humanness on one level. The thinking project which has as its vector, I call it concrescence, following Whitehead's Neoplatonism, but one could call it God. Teilhard de Chardin called it the omega point, but the process by which knowing transforms itself from some kind of aboriginal apperception of the possibility of God into union with God. And the process that lies between these 2 points is the story of the evolution of human consciousness, or more properly speaking, human history. And the interesting thing, I think, about the Western religions generally is their insistence on the tangentiality of God and history, that God was something to be realized in the life of each individual, but that there was also somehow a collective drama of redemption that was stretched out over a very large period of time. And history then becomes the theater, you see, of the struggle between good and evil for the redemption of the human soul. And from the modern point of view, or let's be more frank, from my point of view, this is primarily something to be analyzed within the context of language and our myths about it, and its evolution, and its potential future evolution. So and this is in my personal life, the great mystery to me, because I feel that my intellectual style is that of a scientist, and I take very seriously science, and yet not only my faith, but my experience has led me to believe that the world is not a construction of space and time and matter and energy, that mapping is insufficient, that the world is instead some kind of a linguistic construct. It is more in the nature of a sentence or a novel or a work of art than it is in the nature of these machine models of interlocking law that we inherit out of 1,000 years of rational reductionism. The world only behaves as science says it should when we confine our engagement with it to information that is at a great distance from us, like reading the New York Times every day. If you read the New York Times every day, few miracles will occur while you are engaged in that activity. Essentially what is happening is you are getting your cultural programming for the day, all your switches, if any need to be reset by cultural values, are reset at that point. But when we recede into what I call the primacy of immediate experience, the rules and models that we've been handed by science and what's called common sense are just totally found to be inadequate. And I don't mean when we perturb ordinary consciousness with psychedelic drugs. I'll speak about that in a moment. But I simply mean when we go into solitude, when we go into wilderness, when we endure great travail in our lives, or when we put ourselves in extraordinary alien circumstances, then it's as though the membrane between the ego and something else, which we could call our guardian angel, or the Jungian unconscious, or the overmind, something like that, the membrane grows thin, and the world loses its, its mundane character. And instead, things previously mundane begin to become charged with psychic energy. They become carriers of meaning. They become carriers of meaning. This is very peculiar. At a low level, it's not so astonishing. It's a kind of generalized opening to the world, because everything is imbued with significance. That tree, that person, that greeting, that conversation is imbued with a kind of depth and significance that is satisfying. It's like living deeply. But this phenomenon can proceed to a deeper level of introspection and relationship to the exterior. And in that case then, this significance, which everything was previously seen to have, begins to compress or densify, and the world begins to dissolve into animate intelligence. Now, at this point, if you didn't bargain for this, you're probably very concerned about your mental condition. And if you aren't, your friends are. Because what you're saying at this point is, the rivers talk to me, the trees whisper in my ear. What you're recovering is the meaning. That's all, the meaning that is self-evident in nature, but that we block. The meaning is so pregnant in everything that it can actually articulate itself in your native English tongue. And, talking rocks, talking trees, talking boulders, we define this as pathology. It means, in technical jargon, a severely diminished ego is in danger of overwhelmment by material from the inchoate and disorganized unconscious. Well, but what's actually happening is that for the first time in somebody's life or experience, they are meeting the resident meaning in reality with its force, unblunted by conditioning and denial. And this is some kind of a linguistic process. We and all nature, I think, swims in some kind of sea of signification, of which we are, in the same way that the amphibians were able to drag themselves out of the primitive oceans of this planet into air and exist in a completely different dimension. We, whether grandly or perversely, the verdict is not yet in, we dragged ourselves out of the sea of telepathic, interconnected signification that united all life, and we exist panting and pop-eyed in this other dimension called history, ego awareness, presence of self, sense of loss, anticipation of gain. All of these dimensions of experience really have been added to what was previously the animal Tao, just the howling at the moon Tao of animal existence. And to this we have added, a dimension of future anticipation, a dimension of regret, a dimension of how do I make choices, and so forth and so on. There is not I don't put a moral judgment on this, but it has to be said that in the tradition of the West, this has been viewed classically as the fall. This is the fall into names instead of realities, into constructs of reality rather than reality itself. And this has now been inculcated into each and every one of us as, both the glory and the trauma of human existence, which is our extraordinary ability to reside in and be in language. So, for instance, I've made this example before. A child lying in a crib and a hummingbird comes into the room, and the child is ecstatic because this shimmering iridescence of movement and sound and attention, it's just wonderful. I mean, it is an instantaneous miracle when placed against the background of the dull wallpaper of the nursery and so forth. But then mother or nanny or someone comes in and says, "It's a bird, baby. Bird, bird." And this takes this linguistic piece of mosaic tile and places it over the miracle and glues it down with the epoxy of syntactical momentum. And from now on, the miracle is confined within the meaning of the word. And by the time a child is 4 or 5 or 6, no light shines through. They have tiled over every aspect of reality with a linguistic association that blunts it, limits it, and confines it within cultural expectation. But this doesn't mean that this world of signification is not outside, still existent, beyond the horizons, the foreshortened horizons of a culturally validated language. Well, so then classically the path through this has been through use of psychedelic plants or some form of ascetic practice or fasting or prayer and meditation, whatever, some way of breaking through. And it is literally presented as a breaking through, a penetration to another level, that culture is an imprisoning bubble of interlocking assumptions that are like a collective hallucination. I mean, I hate to say it because it's a recursive metaphor, but culture is like a delusion of some sort, because it isn't true, of course. It isn't true if you're a Witoto. It isn't true that you came from the piss of the anaconda god when he had to get out of his canoe at the first waterfall. That's not really true, but that's your cultural myth and you live inside it. Our cultural myths, that the world is made of things called mu mesons and antiprotons, is of course not true either. But it's a linguistic construct that we culturally validate and live inside. And these cultural myths give permission for certain things. Basically, they give permission to ignore certain kinds of realities. So our language is uniquely set up to ignore, for example, the suppression of femininity. It's also uniquely set up to suppress the statistically infrequent. We really have no patience with that. We have an assembly mind mentality. What we're interested in is that things run smoothly. One can imagine a completely different mentality that cared nothing for statistical norms and only pursued the miraculous. I mean, India, in a way, is that society. They don't give a hoot for, how it works on the humdrum level, but the alien, the peculiar, the other, the unexpected is revered, adored even. So these kinds of cultural values shift, but now we are in a global culture with the combined understandings of 500, 600, 700 language groups and half that many literatures being poured into a global database where some people are assimilating enough of this to begin to play their part in the creation of a kind of global meta program for language. And I think it's interesting to talk about the form that this may take, because I see this as this is not our salvation, but this is the angel of our salvation. If we can transform and remake language, then we can have the conversation that we must have in order to save ourselves. But we cannot save ourselves until we have a language adequate to the problem that we're facing. And English just won't do it, because English is a language of subject-object opposition. It's a language of a past, present, and future. And the kind of world we're living in is not that kind of world. Now, toiling in the background, misunderstood and unnoticed for centuries, have been mathematicians laboring to create what they call meta-languages of description that seem to them very satisfying, to the rest of us very bewildering. A question worth asking is, why is it that this language, mathematics, which we have so much trouble understanding, seems so tremendously powerful when it comes to the description of nature. This is not a trivial question. Why should numbers, in a sense the most abstract quintessence of the human mind, have anything whatsoever to say about the topology of three-dimensional space and time? It isn't clear. What I believe is happening, and we talked about this last night, generally in the form of a conservation of novelty throughout the history of the universe. But I tended last night to present the universe as a material thing. I spoke of atoms compressing into molecules, into organic creatures, into thinking beings with civilizations and so forth. But another way to think of this is a kind of take a spiritual X-ray of the material universe and then say, if matter is merely the vehicle of the transformations that we call the life of the universe, well then what is the inner dynamic composed of? What is it that is striving? What is it that bootstraps itself forward? What is it that self-reflects? Well, I think what it is it's actually information. Information is some kind of ontological modality that is capable of organizing any system in which it inhabits into self-reflection. So you pour information into matter and you get back DNA capable of making life. But there is a persistent spiritual tradition backed up by psychedelic and shamanic experience that says that there are also hierarchies of incorporeal and disincarnate intelligence that is nevertheless highly organized. Well, until the advent of the computer, I think we were just pretty much at a loss to form any conception whatsoever of how you could have consciousness without a body. But the computer shows us that you can have large-scale systems which have degrees, and then there's a long philosophical wrangle which we can just stand as for another time, degrees of sentience in operating systems. So then it seems to mean that information is the thing which uses matter, uses light, uses spirit, uses whatever it can put its hands on to organize itself into higher and higher levels of self-reflection. Well, then, to what end? I mean, what is all this? Is it just an innate drive toward totality? Or is it a process which exists completed in some higher dimensional space, and we are somehow trapped in a lower dimensional matrix, and we have to endure the illusion that it is incomplete? I mean, I don't have answers for these things. This is the business of theologians, basically, to tell us where we are in this universal machine. But I think that what we can do to enrich our experience and to feed data into our heuristic models is to begin to think in terms of language as the material that we need to work with, instead of public opinion or matter or even energy. It's meaning that we need to coax into our lives. Number one, as meaning enters our lives individually, we become more capable of raising our voices, both in joyous song and in political protest, if necessary. My whole shtick, and the whole shtick of the psychedelic experience, I think, is reclaim immediate experience. Realize that you outvote all parliaments, police forces, and major newspapers on the planet. Because who knows, they may be illusions. Complicated phenomenological forms of analysis can be carried out to show that their existence is in considerable doubt. But if you carry out this phenomenological reduction, you will discover that it reinforces the notion that you must actually exist and be real. So therefore, you start from that nub of immediate experience and real being, and extrapolation outward should be very provisional. I mean, I don't know how Buddhism handles this. I grant you all a strong possibility of existing, but I'm not nearly as sure about you as I am about me. And I don't think any of you should be more sure of the rest of us than yourself. I mean, the world could be anything, you know? It could be a solid state matrix of some sort. It could be an illusion. It could be a dream. I mean, it really could be a dream. So it pays to stay on your toes, I think. In practical terms, what does all this come down to, besides that we should speak from the heart, clearly, and with our minds engaged? Well, I think that, remember I said we should see language as the stuff with which we work, rather than matter. And that means creating a technology of the sayable, making the complete understanding of new puns a national priority on a par with weapons development. It means exploring the real implications of substituting Finnegan's Wake for the Constitution, this sort of thing. Because what we're doing, you see, is pulling the beard of the linear printheads who really believe all of this stuff, who really are lost in the labyrinth of the political errors of the last 500 years. We can't overwhelm them by force of arms, nor should we wish to. They can actually be teased out of existence because they themselves feel their position to be so ridiculous. It's very interesting how the way the collapse of our enemy in the Soviet Union has exposed the absurdity of our previous positions. All our previous positions are now exposed as absurd, but people don't draw the obvious conclusion. It must also mean then that our present position is absurd. And so it's tremendously liberating. Our culture is ruined. It's a disgrace from which we can now simply walk away. Well, then the question is, into what? And I believe that our persistent fascination with psychedelic states of mind since prehistory forward has been because in the psychedelic state, from the very beginning, there was an anticipation of the very end, and the very end still lies ahead of us. What it is that our nervous system is in the process of evolving us through a linguistic transformation where language, which at the beginning of the process was something that you heard, at the end of the process becomes something that you actually see. And this simple shift from seeing to hearing is the key to our being able to finally recognize each other and communicate. Print and linearity and what's called ear bias for language is what has shattered our sense of ourselves as a collectivity. A positive way of putting it is to say it's also what created the idea of democracy, individual freedom, labor unions, the vote. All of these atomized notions of human obligation and political participation arise out of print, but so do ideas like that we're all alike. because letters from printing presses on pages are all alike. The idea that products should be mass-produced out of mass-produced subunits, this is a printhead notion. It could never have occurred to anyone outside of a printing press culture, and never has. These ideas have imparted to our existence a tremendous material opulence and intellectual poverty and spiritual uniformity. And now, literally, we have to illuminate our civilization. We have to take its shoddy, spiritually empty Bauhaus skeleton and illuminate it, psychedelicize it, let 1,000 paisleys bloom. In other words, release the design process from a commitment to material values. Well, how can you do that? Because the bottom line of material values is the bottom line. It costs. The reason we build in the Bauhaus style, for whatever reason we got into it, we now build in that style because it's the cheapest around. And once you start adding filigrees and changing things, costs soar. How can you do that in a civilization with a cult of democratic values, individualism, and print-created linear uniformity? Well, the only way you can do it is you have to drop design costs to zero. The only way you can do that is if you build virtually. This means you build in an electronic dimension that is added on to ordinary cultural space like an orthogonal dimension. In other words, it's like a TV that you walk into. It's called cyberspace. And in cyberspace, things are built out of light. So it costs as much to build Versailles as it costs to build a hamburger stand. Because Versailles and the hamburger stand are just two programs that look exactly the same on disk. So what this means is that the previous set of class-created values based on the acquisition and control of matter begin to break down. This is already happening in America on one level where, to live as a middle-class person is to live on a better level than the Mughal emperors ever dreamed of. I mean, what Mughal emperor could stride to his refrigerator and see cases of French mineral water, juices from the South Seas, pomegranates from South America? Eat your heart out, Mughal Delhi. No chance. So, in a sense, we're beginning to create this leveling, but we have created it by looting the material resources of the rest of the world. Conceivably, it can be created in a virtual space where we would all live in this world, a rather monkish existence. But, there's that wonderful passage in Finnegan's Wake where he says, he's speaking of the red light district of Dublin, which is called Moycane, and he says, here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side, but up Nayent, prospector, you sprout all your worth and you woof your wings. If you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. Well, he was advocating death as a solution to life's problems. If you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. My solution is not so radical. I think if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked at your local virtual reality arcade. And then you can be phoenixed in several ways. Well, some of what I'm saying here is facetious. We talked last night about Stan Tenon's wonderful object. For those of you who weren't here, this is a man, a Kabbalistic scholar, who has developed a piece of sculpture such that when you illuminate it from a certain angle, the Hebrew letter Aleph appears as a shadow, and then you move the light slightly, and Aleph turns into Bet. And then you move the light slightly, and so on. In order, his sculpture produces all of the Hebrew letters as shadows from this beautiful form, which he calls the lily. And it ties in with an experience that I had that, well, first let me talk a little bit more about this lily thing that Terence has discovered. He also made one for Demotic Greek, which, for those of us who thought it was proof positive that Hebrew was the language of God, this was a real blow to the chest. But because he did one for Demotic Greek too, and it works just as well, implying, and he's working on Arabic, implying that perhaps such forms exist for all alphabets. And so then I was thinking about this last night, and I said, well, if there's a sculpture in 3 dimensions that throws the 2-dimensional alphabets, then obviously in a higher dimension there must be a form which throws into lower dimensions the sculptures that make the alphabet. So that means all alphabets, all letters lead back to a hyperdimensional surface of some sort, which can probably then be described with some kind of weird fractal algorithm. And so then I thought, wow, this is a pretty Hebraic vision of what's going on here. We have the alphabets of local languages being generated from higher dimensional objects that are 3-dimensional, that are then referent to still higher dimensional objects through which the light of God's love passes, scattering out into the radiance of what can be said. And in a way, this is sort of my vision of the millennium, that we will be resorbed into the Word. The whole story begins in principio et verbum, et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. The whole cosmic drama is the mystery of what it is for the Word to be made flesh. Language is seeking to birth itself into the domain of concrete existence. That's obviously what the Word made flesh means. And it seems to me that if the Word can be made flesh, this implies a reciprocity. It implies that the flesh can be made Word. And this brings us back to what I was talking about at the very beginning this evening, which is the curiously literary nature of reality. That it's much more like a novel by Thomas Pynchon than it is like an equation by Ilya Prigogine. And why is that? Is it because, in fact, the flesh is Word? And that understanding this is the real task of uncovering our spirituality. Somehow it's a riddle, it's a conundrum, it's a koan. If we could correctly understand this, if the world did not disappear immediately, at least it would roll around in the palm of your hand like a spinning marble, as the I Ching promises. It's something about the recognition of the primacy of the Word, that history is the process of the descent of the Word into concrete expression. I didn't say matter. And that our relation to this retroflexive process is an ascent into the Word, a going toward the approaching mystery, and a meeting there in a domain of unknowability. Essentially, this is the casting into being that Heidegger talked about. This is the going to meet the stranger. This is the flight of the alone to the alone that is the driving force of Plotinus's mysticism. Well, that's really all I have to say about that. Between the world, I believe. It's interesting in South America and also in Hawaii, at precisely that moment, every day there are certain species of Lepidoptera that the number of ways these things can present themselves is practically infinite. I mean, I've had really weird experiences with information. For instance, these flashers on buildings where the news goes by? I've had hallucinations where it became a textual hallucination. In other words, what I was seeing was an illuminated page of print, and then as I looked at it, every 50th letter would invert, and then suddenly every 20th, and then every 10th, and then every 5th, and I literally watch a page of text go from being readable to being gibberish, and then watch the meaning come through again in a loop. I mean, I think anything you can conceive of, it can do, and many things you can't conceive of.
I mean, we're all individuals. We all have the gift of bringing our own ideas.
But still, you have to be able to make general statements about it, or you would have to say that it's all and everything.
But if it was exactly the same, it would be boring.
Well, although how would you know, since you would never have any trip but your own?
Right.
One of the things that happens on psilocybin and on ayahuasca that really puzzles me, that I just go back to again and again, is you can be having these volleys of hallucination, and then you can say to it, Art Deco, and click, and suddenly there will be thousands of cigarette lighters, limousines, candy dishes, stuff rolling in black space in front of you. Thousands of these things perfectly exemplifying this very narrowly defined aesthetic domain. Italian Baroque. Click. Altarpieces, saints with their eyes rolled back, dripping gold, the whole thing. And so you say, boy, that is really strange. We click through aesthetic epochs like points on a dial, but then you can say to it, surprise me. In Baroque, not Empire, not dynastic Egypt, not North American Indian, Maya, or Fujiwara Japanese, but something never seen on this planet, but equally coherent as those other styles. And I always think, my God, if I could just grab hold of this, I would be Yves Saint Laurent or Klimt or somebody like that. The mushroom has a personality, and like all personalities, it excludes some things and includes others. The mushroom personality is a radically eccentric personality. The mushroom talks about transforming the planet. It says, I come from a distant part of the galaxy. I have 500 million years of galactic history in my data banks. I have seen 50,000 worlds come into existence and pass out of existence. I've seen ships the size of Australia depart for Andromeda. I've seen this, I've seen that. And it's willing to show you the newsreels of it. That kind of and it says, your world is ending. Put your furry paw into my hand, and together we will march out to the stars. It's this dun 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 dun. Well, so then you take a compound or a shamanic hallucinogen like ayahuasca. Chemically, this is very, very similar to DMT. Experientially, it could hardly be more different. Ayahuasca does not show you images of enormous machines in orbit around alien planets and that sort of thing. Ayahuasca, first of all, it doesn't speak. It shows. You become like the eye of a camera, flying through a world. And what it shows you, it's much more feminine. It shows you water flowing over the land. It shows you plant life growing and dying. It shows you the movement of glaciers over the surface of the land. It shows you people burying their dead. It shows you archaic civilizations. It shows you women nursing their children. It shows you meat. It shows you the stuff of this world on every level. And it moves you to tears. I mean, it's emotive. It's not about our cosmic destiny out there in the starry blackness. It's about coming to terms with the earth and our past. I mean, I've seen states of group-mindedness that were so specific that there was no possibility that what was not happening was no shit, one-on-one, real-time telepathy. Take me to your leader. No, I did have one DMT trip way back, like maybe the second or third or fourth way back, where it was completely different. It's the only one I've ever had like that, and it was completely different. And the way I put it to myself was the big people were home. And it was an entirely different feeling. And many people, actually, I've never quite had this myself, but many people report DMT trips where they break in on an entity who is not pleased at all and demands to know how the hell you got there. And it's this, you know, who are you? And you know, then various sorts of dialogues go on, and one person described being then just hurled through all of time, like exploded back from this thing and going through all the recapitulation of ontogeny, and it's weird stuff. DMT trips, I mean, mine are always as I described, but some people report and these may be synergies with antidepressants or something like that, but apparently very stable and strange worlds. I mean, worlds with alien peoples and animals and cities and, you know, very science fiction-y stuff. That's why this Bell's theorem, I don't think we used that word, but this non-locality that we talked about may have something to do with the phenomenon of the imagination. Like, it's occurred to me over the years that what we call imagination might simply be hyperdimensional perception, and you're actually seeing worlds and places that truly exist somewhere scattered through the galaxies like grains of sand, but no place you will ever contact or visit in the flesh, but that the data is somehow present. There seems to be some kind of tuning thing that needs to go on. You know, possibly with technology. I had a really weird experience years ago. I took LSD one evening with a bunch of people, and it was fairly casual and social, and smoked a bunch of weed, and this went on for a couple of hours, and it didn't really ever seem to come on, and it just seemed to be very light. And then I climbed on my motorcycle and went home and decided I would go to bed, and I decided that I would smoke one last joint before going to bed. And I had one of those stand-up electrical resistance heaters that you get in at the Salvation Army, you know, if you're a poor student. And I said, so I turned it on as I started to smoke this joint, and it was badly wired, and it made this sound like, and as I began to listen to this sound, I like went to lizard land. And I entered into this completely coherent thing which lasted for hours about this world inhabited by these intelligent reptilian beings. And we went through their art, their history, their theories of jewelry making, their philosophy, their polity, their science, their religion, their fashion, and it was like endless stuff about this very specific reptilian world. Well, then later I tried again. I took LSD with my arm around my heater and had by then been preaching it in the streets that this was the, and I could never really find my way back, you know, which is a typical phenomenon of higher dimensional phase space. Ralph taught me, you know, doing the reverse of what you did doesn't steer you back to where you started. You have to find your way forward through the matrix. Kat and I were in the Amazon in '76 taking ayahuasca. We got in with this certain group of people in Peru that took it every week. And, you know, cultures have different ways of handling hassle. And in some cultures it's confrontational, in other cultures not. The way these Peruvian country folk operated was if somebody was screwing up, nobody would ever say so. They would just talk about these people behind their back until the morphogenetic field of gossip was so strong that you would basically awaken to the problem. So there was a complex social situation going on in this ayahuasca circle, which was there was a master shaman who we were apprenticed to, who was beloved by his neighborhood. But he had a nephew, a sobrino, who was a jerk. I mean, this guy was, as Don Fidel said, ambitious. He dealt a little weed, he did a little pimping, he was just sort of an edge runner type of guy. And every Saturday night we would all get together and take ayahuasca, about 30 of us. Older shamans, our guy, people from the neighborhood, and this sobrino, Don Jose. So, I don't know what the real history of it was, because I had just arrived on the scene. But these old guys would sing these icaros, these magical songs on ayahuasca that appear as colored tapestries in front of your eyes. And you know, they had soul, they were into it, and this guy would sing against them. I mean, it's the rudest thing you can possibly imagine. I mean, imagine if you know, Lou Reed were trying to give a performance and the guy in the third row just launched into Old Man River and kept at it, you know. I mean, in this town, I'm sure large guys would appear and say, "Sir." In Peru, it didn't work like that. They just kept singing. He kept singing. And it was clear that this is how it was going to be handled, that we had just divided into two separate entities here. Well, my wife was sitting next to me, and he was sitting across the room from us, the sobrino, and I had been watching him for a long time, and I was loaded to the gills, and I could see he would get up on his haunches, and he looked like a monkey. His face, it was uncanny. I mean, he looked like a monkey, and he also looked kind of like a jackal, a dog with long teeth. He kept going through these changes, and Kat leaned over to me and said something like, "This guy is an asshole," and I just said, you know, let it slide. What do we know? Think of it as anthropology. But she wasn't having it. So after a while, he kept doing this, and at one point, and everybody in the room, every person in the room was bummed out, and they were looking at their laps. All eye contact was broken. It's actually, when I was a kid, I invented a word. The word is fardao, and it means the embarrassment you feel when someone else fucks up. You know, and you happen to just be there, but somehow the aura of it is so strong. So the entire room is just awash in fardao, and the old guys are singing, and the guy is singing. So then at the end of a particularly intense clash of these two styles, my wife just looked across the room at this guy and like put the whammy on him. And I saw these red arrows leave her eyes and like dotted lines go across them. And they moved fairly slowly, you know, more slowly than you could throw a ball or something. Well, when this line of red arrows got to this guy, he was knocked off his feet. He fell backwards with his legs in the air, and there was a big noise. And all the singing stopped, and everybody in the room looked up, and these three old shaman who were sitting behind Don Fidel, who I to that point had not heard speak any language but Quechua, one turned to the other and he says in Spanish, "Oh, the gringa sends the zabura."
the girlfriend in the other dimension, the mushroom, once I said to her, I said, "What should I call you?" And she said, "Call me Dorothy." So I invoke it, and it comes, and then we're off. And sometimes it's easy and loving, and sometimes it's different. I remember one very epic trip I had where I had tossed out a big compost pile from growing mushrooms years ago in another country. Actually, it was a past life, I'm now recalling. But anyway, I tossed out this stuff, and this thing grew, this humongous mushroom. And I had taken mushrooms the previous Saturday. I had taken a full dose, which is 5 dried grams. So I thought, I want to take mushrooms again this Saturday, but I think I may have picked up a tolerance. So I'll just take 9 grams instead. And this is where the learning takes place. The mistakes, treasure your mistakes. So the thing, it's like I'm sitting there and suddenly I realize, oh my God, it's coming at me. It's 100 miles wide, it's 10 miles high, and it's just rolling toward me. It looks, and I barely had time to lay down. That's how fast. I said, and a voice said, prepare, the storm is about to hit the beach. And I laid down, and it was like a tornado hitting. And at one point I opened my eyes, and there was this woman in a full bondage getup with piercings and rubber panties and the whole thing. And I was lying there between her legs. She was standing upright, and she put her face right down next to mine, and she said, "Is it strong enough for you, asshole?" To which I replied, "Yes." And then she said, "They say it helps to close your eyes, cowboy." And I later, in thinking about that trip, I realized the reason the mushroom addressed me as cowboy is because that's most people mushrooms have met have been cowboys and cowgirls, because they're the people who follow the cows. And most people have encountered this thing in the pasture. Maria Sabina, the mushroom shamaness of Oaxaca, claimed not to have been initiated. She claimed that as a child left to watch the sheep and the cows, she had been hungry and had gotten into eating mushrooms. Once I was in India and I was cornered. This guy, I was loaded actually on mescaline, and this guy swam aboard my houseboat, and normally I just would run these guys off because they were thieves and beggars, but I was so loaded that I couldn't do anything but sit there. And this guy came up to me and sat down across from me and looked at me, and after a few minutes he said, "Face is index of mind." And I said, "Ranji, I can't be interrogated now." But it was this thing. He could see, face is index of mind. My mind was swirling visibly there. At times appeared to work miracles. At one point I was trying to test him and his abilities, and I recalled that there was a box that my grandfather had given me that you opened with a little silver key that had been lost for years and years. And I said, "Well, if you can do anything, why don't you produce the key to that box," which neither of us had seen even the box for a dozen years. By this time he was naked and locked in a room at the mission. And he went and he would make these bizarre gestures, these strange I don't know what was going on. And he went into a period of concentration, gave a wild squawk, and slammed into my hand and gave me the key. Gave me the key. He was naked. He had been locked in this room for 14 days at that time. And I was like, I didn't know what was going on. But what was happening to me was, I was like utterly unconcerned for his mental health or any practical concern, which was causing a lot of problems for the other people on the expedition. In classical psychology, this is called a folie à deux, a delusion of two. It's a simultaneous schizophrenic episode. It usually involves a mother and a daughter. I've never heard of a brother-brother folie à deux. But it was accompanied by all these exterior manifestations, freak rainbows, and in my case, an encounter with a UFO. And this UFO encounter had a very curious quality to it. Not that they don't always, I suppose. But this was even more curious than the pedestrian UFO encounter. What happened was, it was on the 13th day of the reversal, and I had this intimation. There was something going on about the Southwest. I wasn't clear quite what it was, and the two women on the expedition were that afternoon washing our clothes down by the Choro, by the lake, and I looked across the lake and I saw in the sky, not a rainbow, but just a spot in the sky that was a spectrogrammatic diffraction, a little patch of rainbow. And I asked the women if they saw it, and they said they didn't. And then it intensified. And by this time, I was plenty in the doghouse as well. I mean, this put a great deal of strain on our small party, as you can imagine. And this spectrogrammatic iridule intensified. And then I said to them, now do you see it? And they looked and they said, oh yeah, it's, big deal, not much. But I knew, and knowing means the voice was speaking to me. All kinds of weird things went on. I mean, I discovered that the closer I was to water, the easier it was for me to rhyme, which I've never. And then years later, I encountered a Celtic saying, "Poetry is made at the edge of running water," and the thing would give me these aphorisms. Like one time it said, "The clone's load is a stoned mode." And, and I was not sleeping. I was now 11 days without sleep. So that night I decided to sit by the Choro, and just because I stayed up all night, and I would walk in the fields, and the thing would would connect up the constellations for me and show me where they were in the sky. There was also embedded in all this thing the intimation of this thing called the teacher, which was a giant insect-like thing that was always like right over here. And there was the sense of something watching us from the sky, something moving us very, very gently but persistently toward this very weird breakthrough. What I hear you asking is, what about the dark side of psychedelics? And I think that's certainly worth talking about. It isn't a joyride necessarily. One thing that is quite wonderful about psychedelics is that, and I'll just speak of the mushroom in this case, is that it's wonderfully kind to beginners. But if you are an acolyte of the priesthood, sooner or later it will scare the socks off you.
And in many ways it can do this. In fact, that's what's so scary about it, is it knows the way to scare you, just like it knows everything else about you. And so in my talk I stressed the facility with which one can access these places, and I sort of teased yoga. It is easy to access these places. The question is then, but is it easy to control and manipulate and understand these places? And this is where it can turn you every way but loose. This is where you want to have your mantras polished and your yantras ready, because in that domain it all works. All that malarkey that doesn't ever work anywhere else, in that domain it works. And so I think one should have techniques, the ring pass not, or mantras, something that you have faith in, power objects. Ultimately, the best advice I've ever come on, and it's pretty sickening advice, but the goal is to survive these things, is Frank Herbert's advice in Dune about fear. And he says, fear comes like a wind. It comes. And the way you meet it is you meet it. And you wait, and it blows, and it blows, and it blows itself out. And then you're alone again. And that's what you have to do. And then in terms of practical instruction, there are ways to navigate through hard spots. Breath control, singing. Singing is wonderful. We tend to suffer silently. And if you get into a pressurized place on a psychedelic, I don't think it's a good idea to go to squeeze down and to meet it like that. I think it's much better to sing, to circulate huge volumes of oxygen through your body and just send your whole metabolism spiraling off in some other direction. Shamanism was defined by the foremost commentator on it, Merciliade, as the archaic techniques of ecstasy. Notice its techniques. And this is really important. This is not a religion or an ontology or a set of beliefs like Buddhism, Hinduism, Catholicism, you name it. It's a set of techniques. And the techniques deliver the experience. And then out of the experience one creates whatever models of the universe seem appropriate. But this is what science was before science. This is what religion was before religion. And it's deep. It's the deepest thing there is. Our society, living in ignorance of this, is infantile and destructive and narcissistic and materialistic and the whole gamut, because we can't touch the gold in life. It's hard for us. It's very elusive. It's far from us. Authenticity is fleeting, and we require psychotherapists and self-affirmation, all this stuff to hang on to it. How I got into this, like the gentleman who asked the question, is by being in the Amazon, by having searched India to see, what can you show me? And they couldn't show me anything. They wanted me to sweep the ashram for 12 years, and then something wonderful was going to happen. But then when I got to South America, I said, what can you show me? And this guy said, let's sharpen our machetes. We'll go out here and get some of this snake vine and come back, and I'll show you. And by 10 o'clock that night, I was sobbing in the guy's arms. He'd shown me. I was a convert. I'd sweep his courtyard for 12 years without asking. My daughter, who I haven't seen for a while, is coming today. And it caused me to think of an incident that happened to she and I years ago here at Esalen. And it's a story which makes no sense whatsoever. but it really, truly happened, as far as I can tell. But it has all the qualities that bedevil this kind of thing. And what it was I was, as I am now, scholar in residence. It must have been some 10 years or so, 8 years or so ago. So Clea would have been like 9, and I would have been 40. So we were both younger and more naive. And it was dinner time at the lodge, and it was this time of year and this time of weather. And the fog had been coming all day in and out in the garden. And it was, and we genuflect here, God love him, to Carlos Castaneda, it was that very strange time of day, which only lasts a few minutes, between daytime and nighttime, the crack between the world, I believe. It's interesting in South America and also in Hawaii, at precisely that moment, every day there are certain species of Lepidoptera that rearrange themselves. In other words, that come out from wherever they've been hiding for 24 hours, fly around furiously for 5 minutes, and then disappear again for 24 hours. But anyway, it was precisely that time of day, and the fog was coming in and out of the garden, and we were not in a mood for anything peculiar. We were intent on dinner, and we were walking the path through the garden, and suddenly, as this fog moved and cleared, coming down one of the rows was a bunny, a small rabbit, except that it had very small, short horns. Now, some of you may know the creature called the jackalope. The jackalope is a large jackrabbit with a pair of antelope horns, and it is a creature known only to exist above certain low-class bars scattered across California and Oregon. It's up on the wall, the jackalope. It's something you kid tourists with. As far as I could see, this was a baby jackalope about this high, and it crossed the trail no more than 5 feet in front of us. We both saw it, and our attitude was not amazement or an awareness that we were entering into a paranormal dimension. Both of us, I think our reaction was, come on. And then immediately behind it was a man, a very thin, not particularly healthy looking man with a shaved head, wearing something like a gray running suit, and he was running crouched. He was with his hands out like this. He was trying to catch the jack-a-bunny, and when he saw us, he appeared very confused and stood up and turned and walked the other way. And I just took her by the elbow and I said, let's get out of here. And then we went to dinner, and we've talked about it immediately after and since. And as far as anybody can reasonably and decently tell, this is the straight story on what happened. Well, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the earth doesn't move from its pinions. But what does it say? It says that attention falling into a certain place of non-attention is set up for something like this to happen. And I can't explain it. I don't think it's explainable.
It's sort of like, when you study quantum physics and they tell you that a black hole mostly puts out electrons, but the theory allows that it could eject Miatas and grand pianos, except that it would be very rare for it to eject a grand piano. But the theory does not preclude the ejection of grand pianos. So it's something like that, or it's a group hallucination, or it's a bewitchment, or, and it begins to proliferate. I was thinking about it last night or this morning, because I was in that place where I saw it happen. And I was thinking, maybe Esalen lasts a really long time. Like maybe it's sort of like the Piazza San Marco in Venice, or the Central Aryan Stonehenge. Maybe we're actually starting something here that will last so long that for the next 5,000 years, people will relate to the Esalen Garden, and that somehow it's a nexus for others on strange missions. Now, the other thing about that story that I like, or that relieved me, is I guess the way to put it, is notice that it's absurd. And by being absurd, it's self-canceling. Suppose instead of a jackalope, which is an absurd creature to begin with, suppose it had been a gray of the wraparound eye type that are apparently trading high technology to the government for human fetal tissue, those people, then you would have had a real dilemma on your hands, because grays are objects of cultural fascination. In other words, if you see a gray, you just become part of a statistical body of people who've seen one. And so it's like more problematic. It's not that it's a non-reality, it's that it's a sort of a non-reality. This is, I think, part of the clue to understanding alien abductions and the way we generate information. If I tell you that I was up late last night and couldn't sleep and walked along the cliffs over Esalen, and that I encountered a shining disk, and that I then had my navel lint was removed by a team of extraterrestrial cosmetologists, this is evidence for an already existing body of data. If you say, well, you should call MUFON, they'd be very interested in this, or you should call somebody else. If I tell you I was restless last night and walked the cliffs of Esalen, and that I encountered Bugs Bunny in the company of Patrick Swayze, people will just say, you're nuts. It's not sanctioned. It's not allowed. And nobody gives a hoot or takes it seriously for a moment, because it serves no one's agenda. It's just insane data and should be immediately tossed out. This shows us, that the objects in the unconscious are given different weights, and you can tell a crazy story and join a self-help group, but if your story is too crazy, they won't have a group for you, they'll have a cell for you. So it's worth bearing in mind. Let's be generous here. Someone had prepared a bunny with horns to surprise someone else with whom they'd had a lifelong running joke about jackalopes. And they had arrived at Esalen for the surprise birthday party of this person, and realized that the bunny was frantic because it hadn't eaten on the long trip. So they took the jack-a-bunny in its cage down to the garden to steal some lettuce for it.
and in the fog and in the effort not to be seen, the bunny escaped with its horns in place, and this person, who probably didn't have a gate pass anyway, could see the whole situation getting out of hand and was frantically trying to capture the horned bunny and get it back in its... See, people say, gee, what a party pooper this guy is. Well, yeah, but we're trying to save the laws of physics and reason here, for crying out loud. But I have to tell you, that doesn't feel right to what it is. It felt to me like, I don't know, we all live in private Idahos, and somehow I was in somebody else's private Idaho for a moment, against my will. But I think we should always prefer the simplest explanation. Sometimes the simple explanation, like in a case like that, is maddeningly complex in itself. But if you don't believe that's what's happened, well then what do you believe? Do you believe that mythological animals are a potential infestation problem in the Esalen Gardens? Or just where do you draw the line? I had an experience earlier this summer, which I probably shouldn't tell, but I will, that is an example of how it gets weird. A friend of mine moved to London and left me his library for unspecified amounts of time to keep. A very bizarre library, mostly Platonic stuff, a lot of magic, a lot of that sort of thing. And so we built a book loft for it, and our house is wedge-shaped, and so this book loft is way up at the top of the house. And I was alone in the house, and I took 7 dried grams, and I was sitting there, and it was just beginning to come on. I was in the show what you know thing phase, and it was beginning to show what it knew, and there was this disrupted area of space in front of me where it was like rotating, and I was looking into it and talking it up. And I was actually speaking. At first I was just speaking in my mind. Then I began speaking aloud, and I was saying, "You are beautiful thing. You are beautiful." And suddenly things changed, and it became very cold, and meaning the temperature fell suddenly. And the dog next door, who never howls, howled. And the cat, which was down below me, I was up in this loft looking down at our bed. The cat was on the bed. The cat flared out and made this really weird noise. And I just, I stopped what I was doing and projected my mind into this situation. And at that moment, I heard this sound, which was like... And then something settled onto the roof, sufficient to make the 6 by 14-inch beam creak in. Just went... And I was floored. And I just sat for a minute, and I was not frightened. In fact, my emotion was hard to get back to, but I wasn't frightened. But just at that moment, this thing was really coming on, and really visually peculiar, and it seemed like the two things were independent. The trip was getting stronger and stronger, but a 10-ton something had landed on the roof beam of my house. So I just sat with it for about 30 seconds, and then this thought or voice came, and it was, this thing has come because of something I'm doing, and that means that I can get rid of it. So I just turned like this up toward the roof and projected this thought very strongly, which was, "Be gone. I am in conversation with an elder." And this thing went, "Woo!"
and there was a long pause, 10 seconds or so, and then whatever it was, it lifted off the roof and went away. And what was weird about this was I had never ever used in my own mind this phrase, an elder, to describe the mushroom. It was like just came out of me. And the whole episode seemed real weird to me, and I just let it ride. But that's an instance where, there is this, let's call it synchronicity, so that we don't have to believe that a pterodactyl landed on my roof. There is this synchronicity. For some reason, there chose to be a fluttering sound and the beam chose to creak. Now, doubtless this has to do with temperature and the cooling of day to night. But, it was a thing to go through.
There is something loose on this planet, is that what I want to say? Or behind reality? Or something? We could call it the unconscious, but that might make you feel more comfortable with it than you should. But what this power can do is it can manipulate your mind. And what it has access to is the complete contents of your experience. It has more access than you do. You, the ego, are a fragile and forgetful creature. This thing, every movie you've ever seen, every television show you've ever watched, every headline you've ever glanced at, every face you've ever noticed in a crowd, it has it all. And when it sits across the board from you and the pieces are displayed, it absolutely surrounds and encloses your mental universe and can manipulate you any way it wants to, because it knows you far better than you know yourself. As an example of this, because it's very hard to catch this thing in action. It's Mercury sly, but it's not perfect, it's not godlike. It's just 99.8% able to do this trick without ever being nailed to the wall for it. Here's an example of the 0.02% where it failed. And if this seems to make no sense to you, you should read my book, True Hallucinations, in which the story I'm about to tell is embedded. But my brother, to shorthand it catastrophically, went pretty bananas in the course of this expedition to the Amazon. And at one point he announced that he was going to deliver a teaching that would, I think this was the one which cured all disease. You only had to do this practice and all physical disease would instantly be cured. And he said, and so here's the practice, he said, picture the number 8, turn it on its side, slide the 2 circles together, shrink it to a point, okay? Sounds like it has a 30-40 chance of at least knocking back hay fever, right? So this was at a point in this experience in the Amazon where he had been raving for days and days, and just everybody was exhausted and at their wits' end, but it was like a bolt of lightning to me, because I remembered that 3 months before, I had been in Canada, having come from Japan, and was getting ready for this Amazon expedition. And one of the things that I thought I should take care of, since I'd been in Asia for a couple of years, was I needed a dental checkup. So I made an appointment with this Canadian dentist and went for this dental cleaning, and arrived to find a waiting room full of people, and settled down to a tall stack of tattered and incredibly tatty magazines, among which was the Journal of the Canadian Education Society, something like the Parent-Teacher magazine, but for Canada. And there was an article in there that said, this was 1971, shows you how things never change. There was an article about how computers will soon revolutionize elementary school teaching. And so, in desperation, I turned to this article. And here's this article. You can imagine what it was saying. But there was this little sidebar next to the article. And it said, the schools of the future will be nothing like we have known. Children will learn in completely different ways. And then it said, imagine little Susie sitting down in front of a computer screen, visualizing the number 8, turning it on its side, sliding the two circles over each other, and shrinking it to a point in order to command an arithmetic operation or something like that. And it was like, nailed. We know where this stuff is coming from. It's coming from our own minds. He, if we want to blame my brother for this, had apparently a complete readout of all this detritus flowing around in my mind, and could pick it up and use it at will to befuddle and confuse me and lead me deeper in. When I was schizophrenic, if this is what we're talking about, my feeling about it was, and maybe this is, if not true, a delusion worth playing with, is I thought, what we call mental illness, what we call schizophrenia, and what we look into the body or the mind or the personal history or the dream state to try and understand and possibly cure, it's not like that at all. It isn't if you're the person who's nuts, it isn't your problem. It's something that's happened to you. Not more fundamentally than catching the flu. It's like you just happened to step in some cosmic doo-doo, and now it's on the bottom of your shoe, and everybody's pointing at you and backing up, but it isn't your fault. It was just happened to be in your path. It's a kind of, it's a horrible piece of luck, unless you can turn it to your own advantage. And what that means, I think, is obviously integrating it. Well, then how do you integrate these things? I think it has to do, again, a lot with where you start from. Just speaking from my own personal experience, what saved me was my cynicism, that I didn't believe in anything, never had always thought believing in things was a bad idea. So then when this whole cosmos of beliefs was handed to me on a platter, I just simply said, maybe, I'll act it out, but I won't believe it. And I think that had I been a good Mormon, a good Catholic, a good Buddhist, a good something else, then I would have been lost, because I would have traded whatever it was I believed for the new set of beliefs. As it was, I just said, what's this? Beliefs. I don't do that. But I played with it, and somehow the playing with it was able to depotentiate it. I had a conversation with someone very recently who, by ordinary standards, I think would have to be considered nutty as a fruitcake. And, they could hardly speak of their condition without being swept by an emotion that was so intense that it reduced them to tears, And I said, if you're going to be this nuts, you should enjoy it more. It's too... And they said, I am enjoying it. And I said, well, I'm not enjoying it because you're just projecting such an emotional intensity that it makes me very nervous. And I think I speak then for the same general masses about that. What makes it hard for the person who's going through this is that it's so hard for other people. I mean, it's freaky to be around somebody who's crazy.
Dennis had this notion of what he called the good shit. This developed in the days after the ideas about hypercarbylation. And he claimed it was like a fantasy, it was like a joke, it wasn't clear exactly what it was, but it was this idea that there was this hash somewhere that had been rolled into countdown. And
good morning. Yesterday, a couple came to see me at the hotel. They had written to me in Boston, and I arranged for them to come yesterday. He is 42, she is 33. He's a graduate of a business school. He started a business which is now grossing 80 million.
But you see then, once we are up against this possibility that the distinction between what we do and what happens to us is obliterated. And therefore we would say with Hindus and Buddhists that if I run into a catastrophe, it is my karma. You see, that means far more than that it is a punishment for something I did wrong in the past. That is a legalistic view of karma. But a naturalistic or organic view of karma is, in fact, that what happens to me is what I do. And that in a certain sense, I want what happens to me. We can use want, notice how we use this word. It means to desire and it means to lack or to need. We say to somebody, you're wanting, you're deficient in something that you need. So it's rather alarming, really, when you consider it, that you always get what you want, invariably. Even though you may think that it's entirely opposed to your wishes. But if it's your karma, everything that happens to you, put in another way, everything that comes to you is a return to you of what goes out of you. Yes, obviously, that's absurd. If you confine the definition of yourself to your voluntary, conscious behavior. That's a ridiculous definition of oneself. Oneself, by any stretch of the imagination, must involve far more than the conscious and voluntary aspects of our behavior. And if we see that it involves intimately and inescapably the behavior of what we call the other, the not-self, the environment, and see that these two are moving together like the two sides of the snake when it swims, then you get a very curious feeling. You have to be careful of it if you've got a Western background. Because, and this is what happens to a lot of people who play around with psychedelic chemicals, there are many, many cases of inflation among these people. That is to say, when you get this sensation that the two sides of the world, the inside and the outside, are moving together, you may think, I am ruling it. I am God in the Western sense of the word. Therefore, your ego, instead of being, as it were, integrated and transcended with all this process, merely assumes vast dimensions, has megalomania, is blown up by the mystical experience. And so you get the holier-than-thou people going around who seem to think that they're above all human conventions and have no obligations to anyone or anything, because they're divine and they can do as they damn please. What they haven't realized is that doing as you will isn't a new kind of behavior that you suddenly put on and say, from now on I'm going to go around doing as I will. You have to realize first that that's what you've always been doing. And you can look at this from a very simple point of view. It's not a complete point of view. But you can say, well, now what about the people who did good and who did the things that they didn't want to do? You know, everybody's mother said to us, darling, sometimes we have to do things we don't like. Well, what about that? Well, you can always say, the kid obeyed the mother and did the thing that it didn't like because that was the better part of wisdom. In other words, if it hadn't done that, something worse would have happened. And we choose the lesser of two evils. And when you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose the lesser of two evils, then you say, I want out of here. And you take the easiest way. You take the line of least resistance. So that's your doing. Now, you can pursue that more profoundly when you stop thinking about human behavior as something that responds to the compulsion of an environment. And you can get out of that when you see the behavior of the environment as an essential aspect of you. So it isn't, as it were, the environment starting something, which you are therefore compelled to follow. It's the whole system moving together. So then, you get in the state of liberated or mystical consciousness, you very often feel that a hill is lifting you up as you walk up it. The ground seems to heave beneath your feet, and up you go. And you get this strange feeling of lightness, of effortlessness, walking on air, never a care, you know? This wonderful sense that there are no obstructions anywhere. There's nothing, as it were, banging you and making you do that. It all flows together. And that's a very common sense. That's, you are actually, in that state of consciousness, you are perceiving the goings-on, the Tao, the course of nature, in the way it's happening. But in the ordinary way, you've been conditioned to resist it, to fight it, and to use those sensations of resistance to create a sensory basis for what you describe as the ego. The ego, in practice, is a sense of strain. When you are aware of I, you are aware of a basic discomfort, which is located basically between the eyes, somewhere in here, a sort of tightness. Also, it's in other centers too. It's in the solar plexus, and there are various physical centers, in other words, where this constant tension or resistance against it is going on. And that's what you feel when you talk about I. When that tension ceases, you discover immediately that the separate ego has disappeared, and that what I refers to is simply the total panorama of experience, everything that's happening. That's I. And obviously I don't know all of it, because I can't inspect all of it with my radar, with my conscious attention. That would be a ridiculous undertaking, to know everything in that sense. We know it in a much better way, as we know how to grow hair and open and close our hands. So this point of view can be understood if we clarify the initial problems we have about it. And I suppose the first problem is, if we accept the notion that everything that happens to us is our own karma, our own doing, then we have to be very careful of, shall we say, the devil of omnipotence, of inflation, of feeling that your ego is what is in control of all this. And the second thing is, if you think then that everything that happens to everybody is what they really want to happen, then you can absolve yourself from any qualms about being unkind to someone, because you could say, well, the unkindness I did you was what you really wanted, wasn't it? You know that business about the responsibility of the person who gets murdered for getting murdered? There is a curious sense in which a lot of people go around looking for trouble. Freud pointed out quite correctly the psychology of accident-prone individuals. They seem to be attracting trouble like lights attract moths. And we're all doing that, but we manage to remain unconscious of it, so that we can praise and blame and play the game which says, that's not my fault, that's your fault. And so we go around apportioning faults to everybody. Because if we're going to apportion praise for what the good things people do, you can't make praise mean anything unless you also go around blaming. Praise and blame go together. Supposing everybody was acting in a praiseworthy way, and we praised everybody for everything, they'd get tired of it. They wouldn't even notice it anymore. So long as you're going to get a kick out of being praised, you've got to go around blaming too. It's very simple. But if you see the folly of that praising and blaming are just creating each other, then you don't praise and you don't blame. You just dig the whole thing. And that's why, when we encounter very great sages, you never hear them blame people, and they very rarely praise anyone. You try to start gossip in the presence of such a person, and you make a derogatory comment about someone. It's as if you had thrown a rock into a well and heard no splash. And a funny feeling, because that you get no response. You get no agreement. And if you praise somebody, there's also likely nothing to be said, except perhaps some remark that, of course, you're praising the beloved in all its manifestations. And this disconcerts some people terribly. I've always noticed that real sages never gossip, never criticize persons. And because they understand so well. The French saying, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, to understand all is to forgive all, is so true if you are experienced in just the ordinary way of dealing with human problems. If you've been a counselor or psychotherapist or minister or anything like that, you very soon get to realize how vastly complicated people are, and to see that they really are in the messes they're in, not because of anything, but that's the way it is. And you stop blaming people, and because you don't blame people, you have open ears, and people come and seek your advice. Because they don't want to come to someone who's a counselor who will bawl them out. It's like dentists who simply accept the fact that people really don't take care of their teeth, and realize that the job of a dentist is precisely to look after people who can't be bothered to take care of their teeth. That's why he's in business. So a good dentist doesn't bawl his patients out because they didn't do this, that, and the other. Just accept it. Same with doctors. They know perfectly well that nobody's going to live by the rules of health. And they're very vague as to what they are. And, you know, there's every kind of theory about how you ought to live and what is healthy, but they change in fashion. And you ought to eat this kind of diet in 1921. By the time it's 1930, they've changed their ideas altogether. And by the time it's 1960, it's back again to a mixture between 1921 and 1894. Something like that. You see, it's always changing. So while the rules are not so... You see, if they were all absurd, it would be easy. But they're not all absurd. There's some truth in it, always. But nobody's ever quite sure. So the function of healers and doctors and so on is just to do what can be done to stop the mess getting too messy. And they must accept it as that. That's their job. If I were healthy, I'd say to the doctor, I wouldn't need you. So you're in business. Now, what about it then? We have difficulty in seeing this mutuality of our relationship to the rest of the world because it's contrary to common sense, contrary to the way we've been brought up. And therefore we have what I would call an initial intellectual block to understanding it, quite apart from any emotional blocks or anything of that kind. But obviously, we must overcome that intellectual block if we're going to go any further and actually realize and feel this way of life's working, this relationship between what you do and what happens to you. Then the question arises, then what do I do? Do I go around saying to myself, all this that's happening to you is what I wanted. I am inside and outside. I am the subjective and I am the objective. And I mean to go around thinking thoughts about this, so as it were to talk yourself into this way of feeling. Well, that's very superficial, because this new sense of relationship to nature is something much more than an idea. See, ecologists and physicists have the idea that this is so, but they mostly in their private life and in their ordinary human behavior are just like other people who don't feel it and who feel themselves in a Newtonian billiards game, even though they've gone on to quantum mechanics. So that there may be a transition from our ordinary way of feeling how things go on to the new way, we have to do something other than think. Because actually thinking is causing the trouble. It is by thinking that we divide the world into separate events and separate things. That is calculus. And Ananda Kumaraswamy once described the life of the liberated being as a perpetual, uncalculated life in the present. And you say, wow, I don't think I could do that. That saying of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, be not anxious for the morrow, the uncalculated life. If God so clothes the grass of the field, will he not much more clothe you, faithless ones? And I've never met a preacher yet who would really take that up. They all say, well, of course, that's too hard a saying for most of us. It's not practical. Everybody has to take thought for the morrow and calculate. Well, at this point, people can go in two directions. There's one class of people who will say, all right, let's live the uncalculated life. let's not make any plans. And before you know where they are, they're living in a filthy pad and scrounging around and living on petty thievery and so on. This is the usual thing. This is got into it the wrong way. The first thing to do is, just as I said, whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not, the relationship between you and the environment is always one that is harmonious. So in the same way, you are always living the uncalculated life. You have to find out, first of all, that you're always doing it, and that what you call your calculations and the things you did were funny little rationalizations. In other words, your ego has about as much control over what goes on as a child sitting next to its father in a car with a plastic steering wheel that is turning the car the way Daddy drives it. Because, as I pointed out, most of the functions, most of the goings-on in you, around you, the circumstances of life, have nothing to do with your ego at all. And you don't even know why you make up your mind to do certain things. We know superficially, we have few ideas. It's like when you enter into a marriage, you have really no control over its outcome. Interfere with it too much. So, when you begin from the basis, not of saying, I should now live the spontaneous and improvident and non-calculating style of life, but realize you've always done that, only you rationalized that you didn't. You always did what you wanted to do, basically. Only you said sometimes it was my duty. But you preferred a conception of yourself as someone who always does his duty. That flattered you. And so you were still following your own way. Now the first thing then is to see that that's what's happening. So that you don't think, well, now there is some special thing I have to do to understand this harmonious relationship between the individual and the world. Because if you work on it that way, you will start from the presupposition that that relationship doesn't already exist and has to be brought into being. The thing is, it doesn't have to be brought into being. It's there. But now when you see that that's so, it obviously starts to make a difference. You do behave in a different way. But the behavior, the new kind of behavior that is a result of a transformation, is not forced behavior. When you try to imitate the way a saint behaves, you have made a forced change, and you know all forced behavior is phony. It's like someone saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, when you don't. You feel you ought to, but you don't really. And there's something, it doesn't ring true. Well, think of the poor Lord listening to all the prayers of all those people saying, I love you, Jesus. And he knows they don't. They're just saying this because they think they ought to. And be very trying. So whenever you do a thing like that, you see, you make a forced change. Now, if the change is to happen in the same way that a seed at proper season breaks open and sends up a shoot, see, it comes from the whole force of life itself. Now, when you see that without your having to do anything, see, you are living the uncalculated life, and you're only pretending you're calculating it and arranging it, then, as it were, you will have a grasp of the total situation. And you can allow it to produce changes in action, which are not forced. So this is why there is always a trend in every kind of spiritual doctrine which says something about grace, divine grace. There must come about something in you, a change, which you can't produce. And if you try to produce it, you will be a victim of spiritual pride. But on the other hand, all teachers are universally saying, you've got to make an effort. There's some discipline. There is something you must do. Well, that's the only way to get it across to people. That you, as a separate effort maker, are a myth, are a phantasm. Because if you really try to control your mind and only think the thoughts that you think are good thoughts to think, you will find that you're going round in a circle. Krishnamurti is awfully good at pointing this out. When people ask him, how do you meditate? He says, why do you want to meditate? Why are you concentrating? Why are you saying prayers? Why do you think you should believe in God? And it always comes up because I'm just a son of a bitch. I mean, I'm out for my own good, and this seems to be the way. So he says, you see, you don't have any genuine love at all. It's all fake. And so you have to find, first of all, where the genuine love is. Now, you love you, don't you? That's genuine. We won't argue about that. But then, when you start from this, I gave a talk some time ago to the Air Force. Their camp, or lab where they make weapons, do all the research. And they got a bunch of us there who were ministers and philosophers, and they had the nerve to ask us what was our basis for moral behavior, personal moral behavior. Well, I said, my basis for moral behavior is pure selfishness. And I'm talking, after all, to realistic people here, and I don't think we need to be sentimental and beat about the bush. After all, you're all warriors and fighters and so on, and you know how rough things are. So I'm going to say to you frankly, I'm out for me. But of course, I don't do it in a tactless way. I don't go around and hit people over the head and say, give me this, give me that. I'm much more subtle. I say, good manners and please and how nice you all are and so on, and finally people feel massaged psychologically into a state where they'll give. But then I said after that, there's some things that bother me. The first one is, if I love me, what do I want? And furthermore, who am I? Because if I'm going to be realistic about getting what I want, I've got to be pretty sure what it is that's me and what is the state of desire in me. If I am desire, see, if I am a center of desire, what's it all for? Well, I think of all the things I want. Well, it so turns out that none of them are me. When I say I want dinner, that doesn't mean I'm going to eat me up. If any pleasure I can think of, is the enjoyment of something that I hadn't thought of defining as myself. Because I like my sensations, I like what happens to my body when I take a fine wine and down it. But then what's the difference between my body and the wine? If I say I like the wine, I also mean I like me and the wine together, the mixture. But then I don't eat you or a friend or a lover in the same way as I drink wine. I live in association and like this. But then I'm loving things that aren't formally supposed to be me. And as I go into it, in other words, as I investigate what I mean by me, I find that I can't put any limits on it. That I cannot experience me without you, or without the other. They're inseparable. But you don't find this out until you investigate it, until you really go into the question, what do I want? And that's the most important investigation anyone can make, which I'm going into in the next session. The question of power. And all these military men, you think they think they want power. And so I said to them some very subversive and undermining things without anybody knowing it until long after I'd left.
This concludes Session 1 of Do You Do It or Does It Do You with Alan Watts. Our program